Hello, hello, everybody. Feel free. The chat is open if you want to pop in where you're coming in from today. Let us know all the corners of the world that are excited about a session with the Embody Lab today. Stephen Porges, Arielle Schwartz, and a really great Q&A session coming up for you. Polyvagal Theory, a science of safety. I'm going to acknowledge as well that I live and work on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations. That includes 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River. We acknowledge and thank the history and legacy of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Ottawandaram neutral peoples, and we offer our gratitude to all the Indigenous peoples who care for and through the treaty process share the lands on which we live, learn, teach, and prosper today. So thank you for letting me share that. And today I'm going to let's bring in Dr. Porges add spotlight, and I'll read the bios as we come in. So I'm sure everybody knows who these wonderful folks are. Stephen is a distinguished university science at Indiana University, where he is the founding director of the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium in the Kinsey Institute. He is a professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina and a professor emeritus at both the University of Illinois at Chicago and the University of Maryland. He served as president of the Society for Psychophysiological Research and the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and is a former recipient of a National Institute of Mental Health Research Scientist Development Award. He is the originator of Polyvagal Theory, a theory that emphasizes the importance of the physiological state in the expression of behavioral, mental, and health problems related to traumatic experiences. And Dr. Schwartz is with us today too. Arielle Schwartz is a licensed clinical psychologist, somatic psychotherapist, and certified yoga teacher in Boulder, Colorado. She's the author of 5 books on the integration of mind-body therapies into trauma treatment, including the very exciting Complex PTSD Workbook and the Post-Traumatic Growth Guidebook. I will say no more. Do you need my support technically or otherwise? I'll be here in the background. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Thank you, Denise, so very much for welcoming us here, and welcome to everybody. And thank you, Steve, for joining us. It is an absolute pleasure to be with you again. And I see lots of familiar faces in my gallery view. Hi, Joseph, and hi, Laura, and hi, lots of you. That it's just so lovely to connect. Laura wrote in, "Woohoo, dream team." I kind of feel the same way. So how lovely. And I think that I really just want to start. What we're speaking about today is about the science of safety and connection, which is really what polyvagal theory is about. And I am so grateful for this community and the way that it really lives this, right? We create safe spaces to connect with each other, even if it's from afar in our little Hollywood squares. I also want to put a little shout out to the Polyvagal Institute, which has our kind of partner community, and so just incredibly grateful for another phenomenal community space. Polyvagal Institute is now housing just tremendous education on the integration of polyvagal theory for things like yoga therapy, for trauma treatment, for addictions, for improved medical care, and so on and so forth. So please also join us over there and ensure that you really are connected to so much of what there is to offer. Very much along those lines, Steve and I were together in Atlantic Beach in October for the Polyvagal Institute Summit and Conference, which was just a beautiful gathering. And we're going to, what my hope here is kind of enrich this community with some of the conversations that were happening there, and really feel like we can kind of cross-pollinate and grow this depth of understanding. So our structure for today is I'm going to be guiding us through some conversation, and I've got some questions prepared for Steve, which he's so willingly just letting me take the lead. Thank you. And then we'll open it up for some questions from the group as well. So know that will come on the tail end of our time. So Steve, may I kind of jump us in here with a pretty broad question, but I'd love to hear your kind of current current thoughts, and I know you keep growing and evolving, but your current thoughts about this polyvagal theory, the science of connection and safety, and how this mirrors both evolution, but also how during times of threat, how we can go through a de-evolution. And I'll just toss it to you right there.
Well, we can even talk about it as developing, or in a sense, regressing. And these are terms that are more frequently used in psychology and in clinical practice. People become more primitive. These are, in a sense, words people reach for when they try to describe other people's behaviors, not their own, but others. So what polyvagal theory has evolved to, in my mind, was basically understanding what it is to be a human. And I would also tell you that I learned this more from one population than from all my learning, all my traditional education and research, and that was stepping into the world of trauma. So in the world of trauma, you learn what is missing or what has been taken away by trauma. And those who have survived it will tell you very, very succinctly what is missing. And what's missing is the ability to feel safe enough to trust another, to be close proximity, all these features that most people take for granted. So for those people, they have still the visualization that someday they will find themselves in a relationship where they'll feel safe enough to give up their vigilance, their defenses. So what polyvagal theory has taught me through this interaction with the trauma world is that our bodies react in a strategy. It's a reflexive strategy of becoming, we can use the term, more and more primitive, or evolution in reverse. The word is de-evolving or dissolution. But it's also easier to think of it in terms of development. And if we were to look at embryology and watch how the autonomic nervous system becomes regulated by brain structure. So what we're saying, how is the brain regulating the organs of my body? How's it regulating the furnace? So what is it doing in terms of my energy needs? What we find out is that the embryology, the development in embryology, follows that evolutionary sequence. We have a system that starts off with, like an ancient vertebrates, a shutdown system, a system of conservation, where there's an older vagal autonomic component that just says, oh, not enough oxygen, not enough food, reduce metabolic demands. And then over time, we start getting a mobilization circuit. It really comes on board with the spinal sympathetics in fish, and they can mobilize, coordinate, get movement in autonomics. And we have learned that as the fight-flight system, and we tend to get stuck with that terminology when we think of defenses. We think that people are only defensive by being like this, by being agitated, mobilized, anxious, hypervigilant. And we forget that earlier stage, which is really disappearing, immobilizing. But the world of trauma has taught me that that stage is the one that they have felt, and they want to be witness to explain what they've experienced. And then as basically as vertebrates evolved into reptiles and then reptiles into mammals, at that transition point about 220 million years ago, a strange type of reptile became a strange type of vertebrate called the mammal. And what they did was they had to nurse. So really embedded in our sociality is suck, swallowing, breathing, and vocalizing, the circuits of the face and head. And we see this in that newborn baby. The newborn baby gravitates, but we see it in adults. What do you do when you meet a person? Hey, let's go out for a drink. Let's get a snack. We tend to leverage ingestive behaviors with accessibility of sociality. So the basic issue of nursing was the defining feature of mammals. And that structures involved in nursing are the structures that become our portals for sociality. And which means that we can't be social unless we process signals of safety. This gives us the full circuit, because we have to be in that state that enables suck, swallow, breathe, and vocalize to efficiently work to survive. But as we get older, it's not, the nutrient is no longer food, it's sociality. So sociality is now the neural regulator of our autonomic nervous system. And of course, all of us have now gone through the pandemic in various forms. And I would say that most of us, and I say most of us, I'm talking about myself, is that even though we crave sociality and interacting with people, once that was open and given to us, it became exhausting. Our bodies had already retuned to bodies that were hypervigilant and basically looking for a social pathogen or a pathogen. Our body does not differentiate whether it's a social cue or a viral cue. We go into these different states. And then, since we have these big cortices that are extremely novel and creative, we'll take that physiological feeling and we'll create these amazing narratives. So it's from this interoceptive, the feelings of our body, that literally gives a privilege to our brain to create meaning. And the problem with that is the meaning is often irrelevant to the phenomenon of basically the body being in a state of threat. So this goes back to the first question. The concept is what polyvagal theory, in the circularity of trying to figure out this whole system of co-regulation and connection, ends up with something extraordinarily simple. That is, we need to feel safe enough to be in proximity with others to experience the neural benefits of sociality. And without that, we are standoffish, defensive, hypervigilant, and we functionally as an organism burn out. And I don't mean it on a psychological level. I mean, we're not nourishing the organs, because what is safety from polyvagal theory? Safety is when the autonomic nervous system is in a state that supports health, growth, and restoration. And what is threat? When the autonomic nervous system supports defensive behaviors of fight, flight, or shutting down. And so we now can, in a sense, dispel terms like anxiety and stress and say, okay, can you feel your body? What does it feel like? What is it telling you? And if it's, the voice of your body is that it's under threat, better learn the language of that, as opposed to what we all were taught. Don't listen to it. Sit down, get that work done, do your job, be a good kid, whatever it is. But the body was screaming. And with people who have survived severe abuse, that scream has become really dominating their lives. And fortunately, they have been able to share it with people like me, and I have a better understanding of what's going on and respect what their body is trying to tell them and trying to keep them alive in doing that.
Beautiful, powerful. One of the gems that you named in there that I want to restate, Steve, is that organism burnout is a physiological condition in which the organs are not getting nourished. That's a really powerful statement.
And just linked to that is, what is the nourishment? The nourishment is sociality. It's the co-regulation. So in the healthcare professions, tremendous amount of burnout. But let's deconstruct what they're reporting. They're reporting that they're not being respected. They're reported that everything's on a timeline. Their report be that they themselves feel that they're not being treated nicely. So they're really saying that their body is under a state of threat. Not that they don't want to be helpful, but they're not getting anything in return. And the return is not money. Money can be helpful at times, but the return is that reciprocity from patient or from colleague, and they're not getting opportunities for a sufficient amount of that.
Yeah, you're speaking so much to the need to return to deep respect for the felt sense.
Yeah.
Which has in so many ways been lost because of what you named before. We get taught to override that in order to sit still, comply, be a good child, be a good adult. Yeah. And to override our body. We see that in medical training. I think about Heather Abernathy's talk at the conference, right? This way in which we have to override even our circadian rhythm in order to serve, or military service, having to override oneself. And so this prospect of reclaiming a relationship, a respectful relationship to yourself, a listening relationship, both in our co-regulated relational arenas with others, but also in how we turn towards ourselves as a self-other internalization.
Well, what I like, I tend to use this phrase, we need to reclaim our phylogenetic heritage. In a sense, what is it that we evolved from and into? We evolved into a species that can use sociality as a neuromodulator. So we can use sociality to support health, growth, and restoration. And what have we done with that gift? We said, don't listen to it. And then what we see in our world, so I want to move one step further on this. The felt sense is a great concept, but part of its lack of, let's say, enduring traction, especially in the areas of medicine, have been that it wasn't objectified in terms of a neurophysiological substrate. But what is a felt sense of safety? It's the autonomic nervous system being in a homeostatic state, all measurable. When we use the word stress, we tend to externalize it from our bodies, and we are being stressed by, or I am anxious because of. We haven't really gotten to the point that we can literally operationalize these psychological constructs by saying, my autonomic nervous system is destabilized. I can feel it, and I potentially can measure it. And it has validity. It's real. And if I keep doing that, if I keep letting it get disrupted or destabilized, what am I really doing? Destroying the feedback loops of that system that enable it to maintain its health. By not listening to the feedback, I am literally creating a vulnerability of injury or disease to these organs. And we basically, we should be teaching people skill sets to interpret their bodily feelings.
Yes.
And not to be afraid of them, but to interpret them.
Right. Beautiful. I love that statement, not to be afraid of the bodily feelings, especially because stress is inevitable, or whatever you want to call it, threats, right? The experience of the activation of our sympathetic nervous system is inevitable. It's a part of life. What I love about therapeutic yoga, for example, is that we will purposefully practice going into positions that will evoke an elevated heart rate, or breaths that will temporarily elevate the heart rate. We will feel a little bit of temporary stress whilst simultaneously working with a calming breath and focusing the mind on cues of safety so that we can actually befriend that nervous system state without jumping into reactivity.
Well, what you're describing, there's two ways we can interpret it, both positive. One is we can talk of it as a neural exercise, and where we are, let's actually backtrack a bit. And that is the triggering of the sympathetics in itself is not bad. That's the first part. The issue is what we call stress. And then there are close friends of mine who are very deeply involved in that area or that space in the academic world start to even elaborate on what they called good stress and bad stress. They got themselves into a conundrum because they didn't operationally define what was going on. And what you're describing is good stress, but that's not even necessary. What we're really talking about is duration and recovery. So if you have acute disruptors, no problem if you have the appropriate context to allow the system to recover. If you don't allow the system to recover, then you start creating chronicity or chronic dysfunction. And this means that we have to, it's not wrong, as you said, to elicit the sympathetic nervous system. It's not wrong to stay up all night once in a while to do a term paper or to be anxious before you do a presentation. But it is wrong if you don't allow your body the appropriate context and time to recover. So what happens is that people get angry at their bodies because their body says, I can't do this anymore. And then they want some helper, some medication or something that will depress those circuits. And the issue is we need to be much more respectful of the feedback loops and treat the whole system as a system that can be exercised and can be challenged, and challenging it isn't bad. And what I was going to move into is the notion, yeah, we many of us love to mobilize, but we love to mobilize with social engagement on board. We call that play. We call that enthusiastic, it's exuberance. We're having a great time. And including, we love to see children smiling while running. So they're mobilized, they're in the sympathetic state, but they're also maintaining a social engagement ventral vagal context, or let's say container. But when that container breaks, and for some people, they don't have much resource with keeping the two together, then you get the chaotic movements and kids will hit each other, and you get arguments with adults because they lose that co-regulation, which can be translated even into another term, and that is role reversal. We see each other from each other's perspective. And we can even use words like symmetry in our relationships. Those are all kind of like metaphors for what we're talking about. But neural exercise is really a construct that I love to use because it has a very optimistic perspective. It says, yeah, let's challenge the system, but let's let it recover. And then over time, maybe it will recover sooner and give that individual, in a sense, greater flexibility in the world, greater resilience.
Yeah, beautifully said. You're speaking about, and I'm going to kind of name this for everyone here, we're speaking about hybrid states, that there's a way in which we can connect into the social engagement system or the ventral vagal, complex of or circuit of the vagus nerve, and we can blend that or create this beautiful integration of our sympathetic system with simultaneous recognition of enough safety to then use that sympathetic system for the purpose of mobilization in a wanted direction and play and excitement and climbing a mountain or a yoga practice or whatever is your jam, right? Going to dance, so forth. We also, and I'd love to speak now about the two different presentations of our dorsal vagus and that dorsal vagal shutdown or collapse versus deep rest and restoration.
Yeah. Well, I would even push the other one that is feelings of intimacy, shared moments of intimacy. We're not even having to talk about sexual activity. We're talking about a baby in a mother's arms and they both are literally falling asleep. In a sense, what that state is saying, it's a state that does not need hypervigilance. It's a state that is safe enough to give it all up. And it normally is brought on by a social engagement system that says, I'm absorbing, I'm seeing what's going on, and I have you, I'm protecting you. And it's actually now probably about almost 10 years ago, I was doing an interview and I was asked kind of a question about these states. And I suddenly came up with this concept. I said, you think of the ventral vagal circuit as a choreographer. And that's really what we're talking about. It is actually the system that if it's on board, it allows all the other attributes of our autonomic nervous system to functionally be their best. And I'm going to talk about some of the being the best. I'm going to talk about gut processing. So in the world of, let's say, trauma or adversity history, and in the world of yoga therapy, a lot of the people going in have gut issues. And that is not, okay, when you go to a physician, they look for the end organ damage. They try to do a diagnosis and they try to treat the end organ. And when that doesn't map out, they start calling it something like functional gastroenterology or GI disorders. So functional meaning that you have symptoms, but we don't know the causality of it. And what is missing from the narrative is a neural regulation of the gut. So, and this is what's missing in internal medicine, where it's very organ specific. And so the organ has damage or disease. It doesn't have, in a sense, atypical neural regulation. A little of that comes into cardiology, where they look at postural hypertension, POTS. So if you tilt people, they'll go into a autonomic reaction, which is, they then use a diagnosis called dysautonomia. And many people with trauma histories get these diagnoses of dysautonomia. But what is the treatment? They get a diagnosis, but they don't really know the treatment. But dysautonomia, from my perspective, is the nervous system is now not regulating those organs in the most optimal way. Now, that leads to the next question, and that is how do you then rectify that? And the answer is, since this is a hierarchical system, and since in a way the ventral vagus is the choreographer of these other branches, your portal of entry is to get that ventral vagal circuit working. And interestingly, colleagues who have listened to me, I often say, it's one thing to listen, it's another thing to implement, but they actually listened to me and they were working on chronic pain. And it's an area that I had not been involved in, but chronic pain is a nervous system that is in a state of defense when there is no specific reason why they should have pain. The damage has been healed. So the body hasn't gotten the message that there is nothing, you can give up the defense. So what they did was they listened to me. They said, well, let's trigger ventral vagal circuit and let's see what happens to the pain. And the pain dissipates. It's incompatible, whether they're dealing with respiratory science, arrhythmia, breathing, or using the Safe and Sound protocol, the listening project that I developed, that their physiological states shift and pain becomes either manageable or non-existent.
Yeah. It's beautiful, powerful research and implementation, right? It's one thing to know the cause of dysautonomia or the cause of disease. It's a whole nother level to know how to resolve it, and resolving it through relationship, through connecting, and the power of attuned listening, which I think is a huge part of that intervention with doctors, of recognizing that these rushed appointments and you've got a 15-minute window and we just have to get you with a prescription in your hand and out the door, versus the attuned doctor-patient relationship, which is what it was meant to be in the first place, right? And to really notice that when we feel heard and understood, something begins to change.
Absolutely. And it's so tragic what happened to medicine. So medicine was treated as if it's a deterministic model, that you can get an assessment, a diagnosis, and you can fix it. And it missed an important point, because the fixing doesn't occur outside the body. The fixing is the body does the fixing. So the body has to be accessible to the intervention, whether it's pharmaceutical, surgical, exercise, or any psychoeducational. The nervous system has to be accessible. And what medicine was leaning towards was a gene pharmaceutical model, that you could do a very specific diagnosis and then tailor a drug to fix it. And they left out the intervening variable, the thing that was in the middle. The organism itself, which is a dynamic system that is responding to the intervention and responding to the context. And what physicians have done since they, started, not modern medicine, I mean the history of medicine, was really the safe relationship. And what happened with modern medicine, the safe relationship became placebo. And then everything became pharmaceutical or surgical. And now we're learning that many of the procedures that are being implemented don't really work that much better than placebo. And now the interesting part is, maybe those procedures aren't so bad, or at least some of them. If they were done in a safer context, maybe benefits would be better. But also in the clinical trial world, we start to understand that the designs of those clinical trials, the so-called gold standard, are designed to show the optimal or maximum reaction of the pharmaceuticals in general. And so it's always interesting to show that the placebo limb is doing a hell of a lot of good stuff. And I was asked to talk at NIH, and this goes back maybe 20 years ago. And it was a conference on, I'd say, alternative forms of medicine. And the title of my talk, I wanted it to be the placebo effect, our body, recruiting our own body's healing. So if we understood what the placebo effect was, wouldn't we want to optimize that? Now, what they told me is that they would love to have me talk. So I was invited, but I had to change the title. And so I thought, really, this is where, some research should go into to understand the features. Now, interestingly, polyvagal theory has identified many of these features, because it identifies that social engagement system, which, when it comes on board, facilitates enables the body's autonomic state to go out of defense, to do its homeostatic functions, which means to support healing or support the individual on a journey of healing.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a question that may take us in a slightly different direction, but it's all related, of course. This question is about when the cues get kind of misinterpreted, and it can be applied to pain and it can be applied to trauma. And but basically, you know, what we find sometimes in the world of trauma recovery is that what maybe objectively are cues of safety are being misperceived as cues of threat, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm not attuning to the actual threats out there, and I'm painting the red flags white. I'm making them safe when they're not safe. And I'd love to talk a little bit about how we refine that and really get greater distinction within ourselves about what's actually safe and how do we reclaim that.
Well, it's a great question. First of all, I would say that it's easier to explain a negative bias, see threat where there is no threat. And I think in the world of trauma, the clients will tell you that. I mean, it's just quite obvious the world becomes a dangerous place. And even though there's no identifiable cue of danger, or at least interpretable cue of danger. And the issue of detection of safety when there is no safety, you could, with this becomes this background of seduction and exploitation of other, and also I think it has a lot to do with power. So if we start looking at where abuse occurs, abuse often occurs in a power differential, and so we're not necessarily detecting cues of safety, we're interpreting language as if it were safe by authority figure. But our nervous system, this is really what I want to push, claiming our phylogenetic heritage. We have gut feelings, and I want to say those gut feelings are really our neuroception detecting cues of safety or threat. The problem has been that if the language is a language of, let's say, inviting and accessibility and positive, but the intonation, the facial cues and behaviors are really threat cues, often we'll try to interpret the language to, in a sense, not listen to our bodily reactions. Yeah. And so being a species that uses language, we really have to understand where and when is language useful. We also have to respect the fact that we're a species that detects intonation, facial expressivity, gesture, proximity. We're, in a sense, like dogs, cats, and horses, you know, other social mammals. We detect features of those that are near us, and we make an interpretation. So there are a lot of people, I'm sure, in your world who don't trust their own view, but they have a dog and let the dog make the decision about the person.
Yes. Yes, that's exactly right. You're also speaking, Steve, to what I think of as really about brain integration, that our right brains are going to tune into the gut feeling, that implicit felt sense, the knowing. But if we're not fully integrating, we might let that left brain take over and hone in on these specific features. But when we link the two, when we use that attentional capacity, we can actually start to listen or start to acknowledge, or as Ian McGilchrist says, really honor the right brain as the master, and that the left brain needs to become the emissary.
Yeah, well, I use I lost what I was going to say. Oh yeah. So the issue of, we talk about co-regulation as if we're talking about like you and me together co-regulating, but there's also a brain-body co-regulation. And what tends to happen in, I guess, the narrative of the individual is they don't listen to their body, and they think that all co-regulation is, in a sense, almost a cognitive level. And that creates these mismatches and mistakes. But if we are, as you were saying, more integrated, so the brain-body co-regulation is mutually respectful, what we do is we realize that our body is being a little bit overwhelmed by the setting, and now we, as an intelligent being, move our body. I used to say you have to treat your body like it's luggage, and sometimes you need to move it out of that room because it can't handle it. It's telling you it's too much, and it needs some time to co-regulate and come back down. And this is the co-regulation, the shared responsibility of our aware brain and our more visceral part. And, we have tremendous respect for, not necessarily respect, we tend to not respect our body until we lose function of it. So it's like, I haven't been respecting it and I haven't exercised, haven't done it, and now it's deteriorating and I have trouble with the staircase, I have trouble getting up and I'm in pain. And that's part of this product of not having that symmetrical co-regulatory relationship between your awareness, your conscious brain, and even your, let's say, reflexive bodily brain that regulates your bodily organs. It's a surveillance system telling you all the time how you're doing.